were 17 when you read Alias, Grace. Tell us why it got under your skin.
Yeah, I was 17, and it was originally given to me by my agent, Celia Chassels, who a lot of you probably know, who sent it to me and said, I think you should read this, but not necessarily for acting. I think you should option this. And I was like, why would I ever do that? I mean, I was an actor. I was deeply ambivalent about acting. I didn't think it was what I was on to do. I knew I wanted to be a writer one day. I didn't think in film. And I read it, and I just got lost in it. It raised so many questions for me that were kind of the seeds of the questions I feel like I've asked in the 20 years since, and certainly what I think I've made work about memory, about versions of stories, about what it means to forget, what happens to rage, who are the many people that we are, what narrative means to us and does to us. But it raised these questions, and I didn't have any answers, and I kept reading it over and over again, and I never fully understood it, and I wanted to get to the bottom of it. So I tried to option it, again, even though I didn't know why I would do that. And shockingly enough, Margaret Atwood's agent didn't want to option it to a 17-year-old actress who'd never done anything and had no intention of doing anything. So it went away, and it went through many different hands. So it went to, I think Jodie Foster's company had it for a while. Working Title had it for a while. At one point, halfway through this journey, I was hired to write and direct it for another company, and then the contract just never came, and I was devastated. And I really grieved over it. And then they hired me again 2 years later to do it, and then it went away again. And I... Is
that company called Cruel Company?
Cruel Company, yeah. Cruel Company, Inc. And then it was about a year after that heartbreak, and I could not let it go. And at this point, I guess I was 30. And I just asked Ron Hay, who's a lawyer, can you just check on the rights and see where they are at? And he said, they actually just lapsed 2 weeks ago, and no one seems to have noticed. So I got them. And so then I was in the middle of making another film, so I basically said to Margaret Atwood, can I buy this, but not now, in a year and a half, because I can't start working on it now? And she said yes. So then I had a baby, and then I wanted to be home longer than I thought with the baby, and she was still patient, and actually a huge support through becoming a mother, and was hugely patient through the second kid. And basically I finally wrote this on naps, with my oldest kid. When she was napping, I would write a bit of Alias, Grace, and if you've read the novel, it's a very hard novel to adapt and very, very confusing, and hour-long increments are not an ideal way to keep track of this story, so it took a long time. So that's the long version.
For a second when you said naps, I really was hoping you were going to say nappies. I wrote it on the diapers themselves. So how long would you say that you were doing the adaptation? Like years?
It probably took, I don't actually know, but I feel like I thought about it for 20 years. I really did. It never left my brain. And I think the other films I made were really talking about the things I think it's why I wanted to make films, was reading this novel. So I've been thinking about it for 20 years, and then really, I think when I actually sat down to write, again, with kids, it's all interrupted and truncated, so time doesn't mean the same thing, but probably a year and a half or something. Maybe 2 years. Yeah.
And do you remember that first meeting where you actually sat and faced Margaret Atwood and talked about it? Do you remember anything that she said to you, or anything that you took away from that?
Yeah, I remember when I first was about to start writing it, I took her out and just said, what is the most important thing to you that you want, that is absolutely important to you to keep in this novel? And I won't say what it is because it'll give something away, but and then, every meeting with Margaret Atwood, you come away with a notebook full of books you haven't read and movies you haven't seen and things you want to think more about. And it really is like having the best university professor in the world all to yourself. And so, my understanding of the book deepened. But I will say that this novel, I don't think you do get to the bottom of it. And after working on it this long, I still haven't. And I would even argue that she hasn't, that there are things in it that you sort of don't understand that you'll ask her about. And most of the time she has the most brilliant answers in the world. And once in a while you'll be like, that's not it. It's so complicated.
The writer of the book doesn't know all the answers. That's amazing. So you wrote this basically on spec, really, for yourself.
Yeah.
And then who was the next person on the panel you reached out to?
Sure. So first I thought it was going to be a feature, and I wrote it as a feature, but it was a 700-page feature. And I remember seeing Dan Murphy, who was our first AD, who's wonderful, when I was in that process, and I said, look. And he just went, whatever that is, I don't want to work on it. You want you to talk to me about it again? Like, it just looked so unwieldy and terrifying. And so then I realized I could make it into a feature, but I would lose everything I loved about it. And I'd sort of recently fallen in love with television. And when it became television, I asked everyone I respected who I should bring this to and work on with it on. And almost everybody said Noreen Halpern. Everybody I trusted. It was 100% Noreen Halpern. And then I met with Noreen, and you know, it doesn't happen very often in a career, but within 10 minutes, you just know that this is somebody you want in your life, and this is someone you're going to work well with, and that is going to make you grow. So that became really easy.
Noreen, other than the obvious draw of working with Sarah, was there a particular thing about this story that really grabbed you? Was there something that you were, I'm sorry, you have to share mics.
It's very cozy. I like it. It's rare. I don't think I've ever had an experience before where someone has 6 scripts that they hand you, where they hand you a miniseries. And not only is it a great miniseries, it's an incredible piece of writing based on an incredible piece of writing. So, yeah, I think that right there was a very exciting moment. And working with Sarah, obviously, who I had really only met. I'm very close friends with her brother, John Buchan. So I'd met her when she was a lot younger. Not that I'm that much older than you.
I didn't know that.
Yeah. But there were a couple of things that Sarah said immediately when, I think very early on, like I think right away. One of them, the O.J. Simpson of it, sort of like just the whole idea that this was the crime of the century. And immediately was like, oh, there's a real contemporary relevance to that. And even just the way Sarah wrote the adaptation, there was such a contemporary relevance to it. And everyone always says, like many people on the panel and many people in the audience have heard, it's so hard to get period made. But this was period that felt so incredibly relatable to a contemporary audience.
They didn't, you just instinctively know. You know, when someone is really behind something, they're not, when people start to raise those difficult, maybe the ending could be different, or, and who are you going to cast? They didn't, you could see that they were amazingly going to be, behind it. So that was what I remember. And that they weren't going to make, well, you can do it if you bring in so-and-so, or cast whoever in the male lead. It was very exciting that way.
In fact, I think one of the things they said was, so when creators come to us and ask us for who we think that they should cast, it makes us nervous because it makes us feel like you don't really know what you want. So it's not that we don't want to be creatively involved, it's just we're hoping you know who, and we were like, that's okay, yeah, that's good, that's okay.
Yeah, we got that.
That's okay, that's great. But it was like Bizarro land. It was like everything people don't say in those meetings. It was just amazing.
Yeah.
You can work with that.
Well, I mean, it's as Noreen said, it's there couldn't be anything more perfect for the CBC. I think we're so focused on telling stories that are distinctly Canadian, that are iconic, that reflect just that true authenticity. And I think literary adaptations are something that the public broadcaster should be doing. And in this case, I mean, I'd always loved the book, and I was so fortunate to have read some of it early on. But at that point, I mean, I was really quite blown away because I don't think I've ever been in a situation where a writer just goes and options a book and then writes all 6 scripts just on her own. Like, Sarah wasn't looking for anything. She was very adamant. Like, I think at first we were even like, no, wait, this is way too expensive. Like, it was more just to read it. And God, I loved it so much. It was so beautifully written. And kind of kept just an eye on it. Well, John would give me updates. I also know Sarah's brother. And he would say, she's in the cabin. It's like, you're always writing in the cabin. I heard a lot about the cabin in between naps of your child. I was like, that is commitment. And, you know, I think for us, you know, yes, of course, it's a wonderful literary adaptation. There's incredible Canadian talent attached, an amazing producer. But there's also something about the character of Grace that I feel is very contemporary and just interesting to look at. I'm fascinated by the idea of the woman who might be less than perfect, that's flawed, that's complicated, and there's something very timeless about that and timely about that if you look at the content that's out there today. So it's actually very progressive and yet historical at the same time. And I mean, it's just the perfect fit for us.
Is in the middle of Canadian Screen Week, is this a way forward, do you think? More of these kinds of co-productions, more ambition, more reaching for the stars, maybe Noreen and Sally?
Absolutely. I think definitely. I think it is getting tougher to make television because the bar is set so much higher, but I think there's going to be less but better. And that can be shorter orders, that can be less numbers of shows. I think there's huge talent. I mean, I've said this to Sally a lot. I think I've said this to everyone on the panel. It's really changed the way I've thought about making television. There is incredible talent here, but you can't compromise. And you can't, the thing that I spent most of my career doing at many companies, and some of them my own, so I got to take blame for it, is looking at a budget, at financing, and making the show fit the financing. You can't do that with television today. I don't know if you can do that with films, but you can't do it with television. You have to look at the show, you have to look at the budget, and you have to find the budget for that show. And if you can't find the budget, don't bother making the show.
Yeah, I would just add that, you know, how can it be anything but a great thing to have this, like, look at this incredible Canadian talent, the most gorgeous novel, all Canadian, be able to be realized in a way that we know can compete in a very competitive, high caliber international marketplace and will shine both within the country, but also will carry this story and this talent, all of it, outside, and will play beautifully internationally. To me, that's remarkable. And so, yes, would love to be doing more of that.
Unless people really don't like it, in which case there's always that possibility.
And you see, they're still Canadian. Sarah G., can you just, for people who might not know Grace, the character, right before we show the clip, can you just set her up a little bit? She's a brief intro to Grace. She's such a complicated.
I feel like you should ask the writer that question too. Well, Grace is kind of an enigma. And what I love about the novel is that there are so many different versions of Grace that Margaret Atwood chose to write. And one thing that I loved about the novel too is that it's a historical fiction novel, but Margaret included every factual piece of evidence that was actually in the real case to try and complete this idea of this person. I don't know at what age you're going to see Grace, but I had the opportunity to kind of play her from about 16 to early 40s. Yeah. So I don't know which age or which version you're about to see, but that was part of the huge task for me was charting this character over a lifetime and over all of these, you know, amazing things and not so amazing things that happened to her. So I guess you'll be seeing Grace.
We therefore commit this body to the deep, to be turned into corruption, looking for the resurrection of the body and the life of the world to come through our Lord Jesus Christ, who at his coming shall change our vile body, that it may be like his glorious body, according to the mighty working, whereby he is able to subdue all things to himself.
Don't walk on a clean floor with your mucky boots. Don't you have anything better to do? You're not paid to stand there and gut. Oh, I'm sorry, sir.
No harm done.
What is it? What are you doing here?
Scrubbing the floor, Mom, as you ordered me to.
You're talking back. I'm sick of your insolence.
All I wanted was a second cup of coffee.
I'll make it. Grace, you can go.
Where am I to go, Mom, with the floor only half done?
Anywhere out of here? And for God's sake, pin up your hair. You look like a common slut.
I'll be in the library.
Close your mouth. You'll catch flies.
Graywall, who's absolutely amazing, and even though it was a sizable budget, what he was asked to do, build all these huge sets, and at first, when we first met him, we thought he was just going to be able to do part of the boat, but when we turned up to film early that morning, he'd done the whole boat, so we could do our nice drone shots. And it was very important, I think we all felt. There's a lot of disgusting scenes of people throwing up in the hold of the ship to really show the what it was like for these economic refugees coming from Ireland. How awful and incredible that passage was.
So we built the inn. So you saw the boat that you saw, obviously, real boat. It's a Canadian boat, but it was over in Europe, so we had to bring it over from Europe. And then Arv built the inside of the boat, which we shot on the stage, which was just an incredible, incredible piece of creation. And you'll see those scenes when hopefully you watch the show. But the entire thing sat on a gimbal so that it was able to move back and forth. And we have just extraordinary scenes of people vomiting and puking and rats and a big part of what is important to understand about Grace's story is what she lived through and the horror that she lived through and the horror that all of these people lived through. And there's an amazing line, right, where you talk about how many days you spent going across the ocean.
I knew from the moment I wrote these scripts, the first thing to go in the first budget meeting or the first schedule meeting is going to be the boat. It's going to be building the underbelly of this boat. It's going to be the squalor. It's going to be the horror of what these people went through to get here. And for me, this was one of the most pressing issues in the film, is that it is about immigration. It is about class. And we look at refugees now, we look at immigrants now, we forget, we all got here in circumstances that were not ideal at some point, whether it be our, most of us anyway, our grandparents or our great-grandparents. We didn't look so different. We were made fun of because we were Irish. We were told we were the criminals. And we see this story in Canadian immigration over and over again. There's always the latest crop of immigrants have a stigma, and we've forgotten that that was us. And for me, that was my line in the sand, was the boat's not going. The immigration part of the story cannot go. This is what we need to see right now.
Can you all talk a little bit about why that was important to you? Mary, you want to go first?
Well, I think one of the things that's amazing about the story and why it does remain an enigma is that in the real Grace Marks, because she was a real person, no one, apart from her one confession, which was a legal thing, no one ever got her story or was interested in finding out the real details of her life or what happened to her, or what happened to her after she left prison. But I think that's a larger story of all these girls and their tragedies, and then there's her friend Mary Whitney, which is a very moving story, which I don't want to give away. But if you've read the book, you know it. So many of these working class girls, their lives were sacrificed. They were prey. They had no protection. And one thing that really struck me, having sort of spent a lot of my early life in England, was that the society that we're portraying here is not really a Canadian society as we know it. It is a British colonial society. It is class-ridden. It is based on a lot of oppression, and an idea of an inferior class who are the servant class, and that class has no rights, and the women in that class have the least rights. So I think, and there's it's not like that's not true today for many women in that position, particularly women who are immigrants. So I felt that was a very important part of it.
Did it matter? Did you feel that women were at the helm of this? Do you feel a difference when that happens? Is that something that matters to you, that's important to you? Is it something we talk about too much, or that we need to talk about more? What do you guys think?
I feel like a character like Grace is so easily kind of an object of desire and fascination, and I think it would have been really hard for a lot of not all, but most male filmmakers I know, it would have been, no matter how great they're, hard to not objectify her somehow, and to see her through a female gaze, but one that was deeply intelligent and as brutally honest as Mary. That for me was like, it's hard for me to imagine someone other than Mary having directed this, or for someone who wasn't female directing this, which isn't to say I don't love working with a lot of men, I do, but I think for this story, and looking back at women in history and how far we've come and how far we have to go, how many of the things that still unfortunately resonate in this piece, but how many don't anymore, I feel like there's some thrill that there are a lot of women up here, and I'm sad to say I don't think it's an accident that it was mostly women financing this.
And then just on a very specific note, I think it helped me a great deal that Sarah Polley got people that she had worked with that she knew were good, like DJ Carson, and also Dan Murphy, our first AD, who's an enormously important person on the set, who was set dad, who was just a fantastic presence and very supportive. So you never know what you're going to get when you're go into a production, but I think that helped me hugely, and Sarah had already, I think, had worked with them and vetted them.
Also, the director gets to decide where the camera is. And there were so many times throughout the shooting process, to Mary's credit, we would look at a scene, or we would be blocking a scene, and Mary would say to our crew, no, this is from Grace's perspective. This scene isn't about Grace. The scene is from Grace's perspective, and that's inherently a gendered perspective. And I think if somebody else was directing, if a man was directing it, that wouldn't have been the same kind of conversation.
The main work I did in the adaptation, as opposed to just transcribing the novel, was for me finding the things in Grace's life that she wasn't allowed to mourn, that she wasn't allowed space to express her trauma, that couldn't get processed in that time, and frankly still can't by women in a safe way. And again, what happens to that trauma and that pain when there's been sexual violence your entire life, when there's been harassment on every side your whole life? What does that mutate into? And so for me, what I was really focused on the adaptation was like kind of following her subconscious, and like what's going on there, because she's not actually allowed to express anything, and still, like we see, I think in a contemporary way, like, we've seen a lot this year, when you're a victim of sexual violence, you are silenced, you are ridiculed, it's still not a safe world for us to talk about this stuff, to express this way, to come forward, and certainly in that time, far more so. So Grace has this horrific life, but she cannot show it, she cannot express it. So what happens to that? So for me, like, following this woman's subconscious was really interesting, and it was interesting to me. When I first read the novel, I was the age Grace is at the beginning of the novel, and now I'm almost the age that Grace is at the end. So doing that over my own life, and sprinkling in parts of that consciousness while still thinking about the novel was really like an interesting experience for me over the last 20 years.
She contains so many fascinating parts, and as Sarah said at the beginning, like, none of us fully understand her. And that's an amazing thing, I think, that has been delivered in this, that there's complexity and complications, and there's evil, and there's good, and there's gentleness, and there's severity, and she's a woman, and men and women are looked at differently, and they shouldn't be, because that's a part of the human experience.
There are a lot of different Graces in this. Grace herself doesn't remember a lot of things that happened to her. She tells different versions of the story to different people. How did that look practically? Did you shoot different emotions into different takes? Did you have nicknames for the various Graces? How did you work together on that?
Yeah, this was the hands down hardest job I've ever taken on as an actor, and it was an incredible experience because of that. But in the prep phase, I had so much anxiety about the taking on this role and the magnitude of the role and how much there was, is that I would go through these periods of intense work, and then I would become so anxious that I would then just have to go out directly and run. And I would just run because I had all of this energy built up and fear and about this role and how much there was to it. And Mary and I would meet every day, and we would sit in my garden and we would read the script over and over again, and we would chart the character together. And that was a huge help for me because we came up with these different versions of the character, and no version was right or wrong. They were just these different voices that existed in this one person, and we would talk about those voices and we would hone those voices together. And it was extremely helpful because in the shooting process, it was very fly by the seat of your pants. We were going at a breakneck speed. There wasn't a lot of time to have those conversations on the day. And we would say, okay, we're doing this grace, we're doing that grace, we're doing this grace. And we would do different takes of one scene, and we would do it with just adjustments. And I think it's a really brave way to work. It was a way that Mary suggested that we go, and it was very brave to say, okay, we don't have all the answers right now, and finding those having this kind of end goal is not what we're here to do. We're here to explore everything that's in between, and that's a very scary and brave way to work. And it was. I'm so thankful that I was able to do that with you.
The astonishing thing for me after like 20 years of imagining something and was how, like, Sarah doesn't miss a beat of what's in the novel or the scripts, like not one beat, and there are a gazillion beats and they're all crucial, and just the agility was astonishing, like how she could play something so challenging, like 10 pages of dialogue, quilting, and with such commitment, and then take a note, and the whole thing kind of reorganized itself. But it was also like there's just not a bad take that I've seen. I mean, it was just an insane, just the agility as an actor. And I really think there have been so many actors over the years who were attached to play this part, like Keira Knightley was at one point, Cate Blanchett, not my version, but other people's versions. And I don't think there's a single actor in the world who could have played this part other than Sarah. It was just amazing, yeah.
Yay.
I stopped sleeping.
I should have probably said that to you one-on-one at some point, but.
How, as filmmakers, do you keep that from, like, how do you keep that kinetic, even though it is, just two people talking in a room?
It's funny, I think I was the only person who wasn't worried about those scenes. Everyone else was so worried about that they would be boring or something, and I know that, of course the actors were worried about learning this vast amount of material, and they were just sitting down looking at each other. One thing we did do was we moved them around the room in different places, and actually, because each day of shooting was a day in the script, was an episode in the script. I would move, gradually they're moving closer and closer. So in the very last one, they're sitting side by side. But I just thought, if you have two great actors, and one of the things about Edward Holcroft, who we cast as Simon, is he's fantastic at listening. He's a great listening actor, and his face is very, reads really well. I feel like, it's great dialogue. That's why I was never worried about it. If it's fantastic dialogue with a lot, acres of subtext, and you have two great actors, then it's going to be interesting. It doesn't matter that they're just sitting in chairs. There's a tremendous amount going on, and then also, it's triggering the flashbacks. But yeah, I was not.
I watched. I went into the editing suite yesterday, and I watched the first scene between Grace and Simon when they meet for the first time in prison. And that was the scene that I had auditioned with, so I know this scene. And I'm watching this scene and I'm thinking, oh God, yeah, there's also that. Oh man, and there's that too. And that's the thing about great writing, is that there's endless endless possibilities with it. And Margaret Atwood is a brilliant writer. The text is it's so compelling. And what Sarah lifted from that novel and how she adapted it is endlessly fascinating. And so the most difficult thing for me about those scenes was that we shot on a sound studio, and it wasn't really a sound studio. So while we were doing, all day, every day, 7 days of those interviews, we'd have to stop in the middle for planes, which, if you've been downtown Toronto with Porter, was every 10 minutes. So we would be or more, and depending on rush hour, and we would be in the middle of a take, and we would be right in the moment of an intense moment, an intense story, and then it was like, plane, so we'd pause. And then we'd start again. And then it was plane, and then we'd start again. So that was, for me, the most challenging part about those scenes.
DJ Carson is not here, who's our producer, phenomenal. Couldn't be here today because he's working on this little movie called Star Wars. But we had a stunning production team.
Yeah.
The entire team.
Brendan.
Our DP, Brendan Stacy, phenomenal. But really hard from a production standpoint.
It was also really good to block shoot because each location felt like its own world with its own tone and its own catharsis emotionally. Yes. And then having pretty much finished the shoot with the Simon and Grace therapy sessions was really great because I was talking about things that I'd already actually gone through emotionally as an actor, and moments and beats that I had already played. So it didn't feel like I was retelling something that I didn't have a connection to. I was saying all these things and retelling my story, but also, having just done it all, it really felt like I had a very real connection to it, which I think was also helpful when you're describing your life to somebody.
Yes, I thought that was huge. I don't know what point that was decided, but it seemed the only way to do it. That we then also, for me, I knew kind of roughly what we'd be cutting to, and that helped to Norris. But I think most important emotionally, that Sarah was actually recalling things that had happened to her.
Yeah, and relationships that I had established as well.
Can you imagine writing this any other way but doing them all at once and having them be done and working on them all as a piece? Like, it seems like it must have been an enormous challenge for yourself. Like, I'm going to do 6 hours of television and then just see what happens. But I mean, is there any other way it could have been done, do you think?
I don't think so. Part of the reason, I think one of the smartest thing I did was I got a filmmaker much more experienced than I am to direct it. I think that I knew that this was giant and daunting and not something I would be able to take on either tonally or just in terms of the ambition of it. I knew it was kind of crazy. I felt like, I also sort of have this, I feel like I haven't mentioned him, but like John Buchan, my brother, who other people have mentioned, he's always sort of a creative partner for me. So, he fell in love with Alias Grace at the same time I did, and we talked about it for 20 years, and he's the casting director on the project, and he's the person really who and co-executive producer, and he put Noreen and I together, and he was the one who said, why are you stressing so much about who's gonna direct this? Like, just think of your favorite filmmakers, marry Harron. And he kind of is always, with all my projects, he kind of is the one who gathers things and then steps back and takes no credit. So I felt like even though it was daunting writing this and daunting, like to have someone who understands the tone consistently as you're going along, and I don't think I could do it in total isolation without somebody, who wasn't, playing Grace for me every time I saw him for dinner. And so it was. There's a lot of Johnny playing Grace over the years, which really helped things along.
Well, I'm going to open it up for questions in a couple more minutes. I'm just going to ask you a couple more questions. Was Atwood involved start to finish? Did she come back in? How much did she live in your consciousness? Did you wear a what would Margaret do bracelet?
So much. So also, I also have to admit that there's no way I would have gotten this done or pushed through it all or insisted on a ridiculous budget had it not been for being slightly afraid of Margaret Atwood. Like, that is an incredibly motivating thing. She's been incredibly supportive of me, incredibly nurturing, such an ally, but I certainly was not going to let her down. That was just not an option. So she read every draft, had amazing notes. Some of which were, the final draft, she would just go, I have a note. Simon wouldn't be fooling around in the barn with farm stuff. Like, that was her note for the final draft. But she was just really great notes, great historical input. And then with casting, there wasn't a single casting decision we made that she didn't have input into.
She knows actors. She knows.
We sent her every tape of everyone we wanted to cast, because and what was especially interesting was, when there would be controversy. Like, if there was ever a disagreement between Mary and I about a casting thing, it was Margaret was the tiebreaker, and she always sided with Mary. And I was like, yes, we have the right director. So, and I think that was something that I knew about Mary, was there's something about this book she was going to understand better than I could in terms of how to make it what it was on the page and translate that to the screen. But Margaret was intensely involved in the entire process. And again, incredibly supportive both personally and professionally through the whole process of making it happen.
And she came down to the production office. She came down when we were in prep. Arv gave her a tour of the sets. I mean, it was this amazing, amazing day where our crew was so thrilled to have Margaret Atwood there, and she was so thrilled to be there as well. It was a really memorable time for all of us, and a little terrifying.
It's not a spoiler to say that she also has a cameo in this. Sally, do you want to talk about that a little bit?
I haven't seen the cut, but
Just make something up.
she's the other Grace.
Sarah, do you want to? Yeah.
She was supposed to be a background performer, and she gave herself a line. So all of a sudden, the sound guy was like, should I mic her? And I was like, I guess so. And the script supervisor was like, is that line okay? And I would think it would be, yes. I think her ad lib will be just fine. So, yeah.
Do we have to check with the writer on that? People are sort of saying it looks great for television, or it looks like a film on television. But does that line still exist? Is that a fair? Okay.
I mean, we've just never thought of it that way. I completely know what you're saying, and when you think about a traditional TV movie or a traditional miniseries, but I think that's one of the incredible things about this project, but also just the way we're seeing content today, really. It's really about the platform. It's not about, is this television, is this feature, is this digital? It's what is the content, who is the audience? I think we've transcended that barrier. That really didn't come to mind. It's almost about what length of time do you need to really realize this content? So yeah, there's definitely been a mind shift there.
Okay, for those who didn't hear, release pattern, second part of the question. First part of the question, has Netflix done something that's specifically Canadian before?
To my knowledge, no, but I can't say that for 100% certainty. It's a really great question about the release pattern, and that was definitely an issue, and one that went through quite an intense negotiation. And I think there were compromises made on both sides, because the difference being here in particular, if you're working with a U.S. partner who doesn't bleed into Canada, you're fine. You've got your broadcast, they've got their broadcast, but Netflix has a presence in Canada. So that complicated matters for sure. CBC does have the worldwide premiere. It will air entirely, yes, week to week on CBC, and then it'll be up on our player, and then it will drop on Netflix in the US, and then there's a delay before it drops in Canada on Netflix. So it was a complicated negotiation, but again, what I'd say is completely worthwhile.
Is there an image, a moment, a scene, an idea that you're so glad that you had a chance to get out there? Was there something that you wanted and you've had the chance to do that now? And that goes for any one of you who've lived with this for as long as you have.
Well, one of the best things is when I read the scripts, it was like, these are great, but I don't know about the last one. I don't know how we're going to I don't know, there's a big hypnotism sound. I don't know how we're going to bring this off. I'm really not sure about that. And it is my favorite thing. It is the thing I'm so happy about. And so that is really magical when that happens, and something that you weren't sure. And sometimes happens, the thing you're most worried about. And actually, although I wasn't so worried, but you were worried about the study scenes. They're great, but it was so exciting to see that. All I can say is it involves a veil. It's like, we can't do all those pages with her covered by a veil. It's fantastic.
The moment that is the most sort of resonant for me, and maybe it'll change the more I watch it, but there are moments of like great, huge production value, and there's moments of massive drama, and there's moments that are horrifyingly painful and visceral. And the image, when you asked that question, the first image that came into my mind is the stillest moment in the whole film, which is the very, very end. And it's just Sarah looking at the camera. And it's a really beautiful, beautiful encapsulation, right, of like everything that's happened.
I can't really top that. Jesus.
But you okay. But,
Thanks,
but,
Noreen.
No, but Sally, you will come. Let's come back on Monday after Sally's scene.
I haven't seen the cut yet.
She sees it. She sees it on Friday.
So excited.
Is there anything in the script that you're dying to see? Anything in particular?
Well, we've seen the dailies.
Yeah.
And what I will say, because we've got our team here, Helen and Tara, who are the execs working on it, it just became a thing. You know, you have bad days. Everyone has bad days. Things happen. Their kind of mantra was, but it's okay, we just watched some of the Alias Grace dailies. And then it became a thing. Like, do I need to do that today? Is today an Alias Grace daily day? Because it just reminded you of why everyone's doing what they're doing, and it's, yeah.
But I think being in the actual courtroom, dressed up as Grace, in this giant, which is Nancy's dress, Nancy's pink dress, wearing Nancy's pink dress and Nancy's bonnet, it really hit me that I had become this person.
Well, you know, it's sort of a more general answer, but I've spent my childhood on the CBC in this bucolic vision of this time that never existed in this country. And so to be back on the CBC with this very brutally honest look at what it was like for women in period costumes, and people get spattered in blood, was extremely cathartic. And I feel like further to that, you know, to have a CBC that is a place where you want to bring this kind of story, and that, you know, from the beginning, the people who are in these jobs now at the CBC, people like Sally and Tara and Helen, these are the people that I would send my scripts to for notes, whether I was working with them or not. And they're in these jobs now. And I think these moments where the right people are at the right jobs in our cultural institutions are rare. They don't last forever. And you just like want to see as much happen as you possibly can while this is the moment we're in, because it's a relief. You know, I've been involved in these cultural institutions my entire life, and finally you feel like I can do exactly the work that I want to do. Somebody will not just get it, but give input to make it much better. I'm excited to get notes as opposed to figuring out how to defend myself. This is a rare moment. So for me, it was just the whole thing of it being with the CBC in this, you know, in this period, looking at this period of Canadian history that I'm totally fascinated by, but I feel is, you know, it's a few years later, Road to Avonlea, but, you know, involved in, as much as it was nice for families, it was a bit of a lie. And this isn't, and that makes me really happy.
Wow. Well, thank you
Can I give one, that was so perfect, and we should have ended on that, but I have to give one last shout out to Robin, who is sitting over there, because we've talked a lot about the budget. We actually weren't financed when we started shooting. And Robin came in at the, like, what is it, the 12th hour? And gave us that last piece of money that we needed. So, yeah.
Well, thank you so much. Thank you for making it. Thank you for sticking with it. Thank you for championing it. And thank you so much for being here, all of you. Thanks so much for coming out.